Thank you, David, and for this kind introduction. And listening to you, I certainly plan to live a long life still ahead of me. There's so much to do. But it's an honor actually to talk to all of you on the second day of your Making Global Goals local business event, which I applaud, and also want to thank you for being the vice chair, for being the chair in Australia of the UN Global Compact. It's an important organization. And as you still have 23% in your audience that don't have sustainability, which is basically the future of mankind, if you want to put it simple, as a priority, there's hopefully some positive things coming out of this conference. And we, with the best will, could convert everybody, because this is our main priority and it should be in everybody's job. I also looked at what you've done as a chair of the UN Global Compact. Obviously an active chapter in Australia, but I noticed that you were well ahead of your time, David, because in 2008 you already did your dissertation on building social capital through corporate social investment. I wish more people would have read it, and probably we would have been in a better place. Australians are spreading out. You need to keep some in your country, but I worked with John Denton for the ICC, with Sharon Burrows, when we with the new Climate Economy Commission, and obviously the Just Transition. And then now you have Andrew Liveris, who is currently in Australia, who's a fellow member of the B team. And then you have Matthias Cormann, who's coming into the OECD. And hopefully we can convince him soon that climate change is an issue and that carbon pricing might be a good idea. So I hope that he will rise to the challenge at the OECD, because they have a key role to play. But Australians are everywhere, and I'm also glad to see that so many companies are engaged, because there's no doubt that we're living in turbulent times. You might have less of that in Australia. It's refreshing to see so many of you meeting in person. That is not happening in any country outside of yours, bar New Zealand perhaps. But what is clear is that the COVID crisis is not only a health crisis or economic crisis like no other, but also that it has impacted the lives and livelihoods of most people in the world. And this is not something that is going away lightly. What we now see happening in India and the tragedies unfolding right in front of our eyes is soon to be transported to Africa or other parts of the world. We just have to figure out how to live with it. But it's also a clear reminder that we cannot play around with the planetary boundaries. The global economy contracted last year by 4.4%. About $28 trillion of output was lost in terms of GDP. Governments spent together about $16 trillion on rescue and stimulus packages. And that's before we even get out of it. This is just the beginning, I think, of a significant reorientation of our global economy. The good thing is that 95% of the CEOs we talk to, actually in any survey anywhere around the world, say that they don't want to go back to where we came from. They want to build back better and construct something more productive. They can see now very clearly that the cost that we are incurring of our inabilities to do the right thing, to be honest, are significantly higher than what it would cost us to prevent these things in the first place, in my opinion. So it's tough to be a CEO nowadays. There's no question about that. Most of you undoubtedly are in the private sector. But what we're seeing here is a fundamental change that we've never seen before. Probably the scale of the Industrial Revolution, but with the speed of the technological revolution. I would argue that signs of our failing economic system were already there well before the pandemic. In fact, we had SARS, Zika, Asian flu, Ebola. These were all zoonotic diseases that really came from our destruction of our biodiversity or our natural habitat. We just have to learn how to live better in harmony with planet Earth. Hubert Reeves said it well. He's a philosopher in Canada when he said, man is the most insane species. He worships an invisible God and destroys a visible nature, not realizing that the visible nature he destroys is the invisible God he worships in the first place. And that is what we are doing. The two main challenges that we have in front of us, and you might think you're living in a isolated island somewhere on the planet that nobody really fully has discovered yet, but it will hit you as well, and in fact it is hitting you, is climate change and inequality. Many people would argue these are two sides of the same coin. Our current economic model is neither sustainable nor inclusive. I think in the financial crisis we already saw that a model built on high levels of overconsumption, high levels of debt, leaving too many people behind, will ultimately not work. In fact, I would argue that in any model where too many people are left behind or don't feel that they're included, these models will ultimately rebel against itself. And I think you're starting to see that in most places in the world. Climate change, you're well familiar with that. Our consumption pattern is unsustainable. Last year, World Overshoot Day, which was the day that we were using more resources than the world can replenish, was August 22nd, which means that after that date, we're using more resources than the world can replenish. We're actually stealing from future generations. Only 9% of all the things we produce in the world and the materials we use is reused. 91% goes into landfills, incineration, or increasingly into the oceans. That's not a way to live. We cannot have this infinite growth that many aspire to on a finite planet. Anything you can do infinitely, by definition, is unsustainable. Nature has seen a shocking 68% decline just in the past 5 decades alone in the average numbers of mammals, or fish, or birds, or reptiles. Some people call it the 6th great extinction. The question is, when is it our turn? We've cut down half the world's rainforests and are very good at continuing at that pace, or actually in the case of Brazil, actually accelerating. Some people predict that by 2027, we already might pass the 1.5 degrees, and we're still on a trajectory of 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And that is at an incredibly high cost, as science will point out, for all of us. The Australians, if you like it or not, are not exempted from this. The bushfires that you've seen, 18 million acres of land, 2,100 homes, 34 people have lost their lives, and that's just a warm-up for what is going to come. Your Great Barrier Reef, one of the world's natural treasures, is rapidly disappearing. We need to act, and we need to act fast. Lofty promises by 2050 don't do it anymore. People debating the 2 degrees is not enough anymore. As a minimum, we need to be net zero by 2050 to stay below 1.5 degrees. By all means possible, by the way, at an economic cost significantly less than if we don't act. In fact, if we don't act, the cost would be significantly higher. There's no economic comparison that wins versus acting. And we're close to a negative feedback loop, may I say, where the melting of the Arctic or the Borealis, or actually the rainforests themselves, become carbon emitters. Nature, just to remind everybody, provides us about $125 trillion of services. 40-50% of business depends directly on nature. Many of you don't pay for those services, but boy, do we depend on them. The second issue is inequality. As I said, we're leaving too many people behind. 4.5 billion people still living on less than $5 a day. 1.6 billion vulnerable workers. 800 million people still going to bed hungry in this world, not knowing if they wake up the next day. And by the way, we all have the audacity to waste 30 to 40% of the food we produce. COVID alone has driven back 120 million people in extreme poverty, and 500 million equivalent jobs have been lost. Yes, social cohesion is going to be one of our biggest challenges. In fact, the combined loss of all the workers in the world has been $3.8 trillion during this period. And interestingly, the billionaires made collectively $3.9 trillion more during the pandemic. Just the money that the billionaires made more would pay for all of the vaccines that we need to inoculate everybody in this world, would pay for sending the 242 million children to school who currently are not in education, would actually pay also to avoid these 800 million people going to bed hungry. Inequality has gone up. And frankly, once more, not to make you feel uncomfortable, but in Australia, you're dealing with the same issues. Your indigenous people earn 33% less and face unemployment rates twice as high as other Australians. Your gender gap, if you like it or not, your index versus other countries has actually decreased from being in 15th place in the world in 2006 to 50th if I look at the Sustainable Development Goals. That's 50th out of 156 countries. Just on global gender, you're ranking now in line with Georgia and Suriname, if you know where that is. The capital is Paramaribo, one of the previous colonies of my country, the Netherlands. And you're well behind even places like the US, Canada, the UK, or France. On the Sustainable Development Goals, on the global goals as we call them, who have a simple objective to irreversibly eradicate poverty and do that in a more sustainable and equitable way. In other words, not leaving anybody behind, you are actually running quite far behind. And I'm not even talking with the current government or getting into politics on the grossly irresponsible positions being taken on climate change. Now, unfortunately, we all know that global governance isn't quite working. We deal with institutions that have designed during the time of Bretton Woods in 1944, when, as a coincidence, 44 countries came together and created these wonderful institutions like the OECD or the WTO, its forerunners, the Security Council, the World Bank. Unfortunately, the world has moved on. Issues have become more global: cybersecurity, financial markets, climate change, now the pandemics. But these institutions haven't really lived up to adapting to the changing times. On top of that, as we're not addressing these issues of climate change and inequality, more people dissatisfied, voicing their concerns in the ballot boxes, it's also clear to say that we see more populist, xenophobias, nationalist governments that actually don't feel that cooperation is the best move forward. It's getting a little bit better with the recent US elections, but we still have a long way to go. Let's not fool ourselves. It's for that reason that I advocate very simply that although as business people, we've benefited for a long time of functioning governments, now that it is a little bit more difficult, we have to step up to the plate. If we don't, we actually pay the price for that ourselves. Business cannot succeed in societies that fail, nor do I believe that business can be a bystander in a system that gives them life in the first place. Business globally accounts for 60% of GDP, 80% of capital flows, 90% of the job creation. So it's absolutely important that we actively participate. The Sustainable Development Goals that we talked about, this wonderful blueprint that we have for business, requires an incremental investment of about $2 to $3 trillion a year versus what we're currently spending. The collective amount of ODAs, overseas development aid, of all the governments is only 160 billion. So there is no doubt in my mind that we need to unlock the technology, the know-how, the financing, the people, etc., of the private sector to get there. And boy, what business opportunity is this? When we developed the Sustainable Development Goals, which I had the opportunity and honor to participate in, we could see that 17 goals and 169 targets might be a little bit too much for anybody to digest. So we created the Commission of Business and Sustainable Development, which I asked Mark Malloch-Brown to chair at that time. And just by looking at 4 areas, health and well-being, energy transition, food and land use, and mobility, we found an opportunity of $12 trillion between now and 2030 to be unlocked. And equally importantly, to create an incremental 380 million jobs. Whatever goal we look at, whatever angle we take, we see that the cost of inaction is now higher than the cost of action. In fact, I would argue that for each of the goals right now, and I repeat this, for each of the goals right now, we are already incurring higher costs than it would be required to implement all of the goals. If you take that very simply, climate change was already estimating to cost us a few years ago $5.3 trillion. That's more than the 2 to 3 trillion incremental I've talked about. Gender equality, goal number 5, holding women back, is preventing the economic forces of 25 trillion to be unlocked. On peace and justice, the goal number 16, we're paying currently 8 to 10% of our GDP, 3 times more, to deal with the conflicts and the wars and conflict prevention that we could have avoided by addressing these issues in the first place. And I could go on and on for each of the goals. So business that understands these cost benefit equations can turn this around and say, I have an enormous opportunity to embrace the sustainable development goals. And it is our responsibility when government fails. Even in Australia, 66% of Australians actually agree that the CEOs should step up when governments don't fix the societal problems. We now see that about 50% of the companies that participate in the UN Global Compact embed the sustainable development goals in the core of their business. And about 40% of them are actually designing their business models around the sustainable development goals. Very much what we did in Unilever, with the insight of having worked on developing these goals, it became actually our reason for being and the driver for growth. Each of our brands had this higher purpose addressing the sustainable development goals. A toilet cleaning brand like Domestos attacking the issues of open defecation. A body cream brand like Dove working on giving women self-esteem. A bar soap brand like Lifebuoy simply helping children reach the age of 5, when 4 million children still die unnecessarily in this world from infectious diseases like pneumonia or diarrhea that could be prevented by a simple act of hand washing. Now, I'm very glad to see that also in Australia, you're using your rights of advocacy by getting at least the organizations together to encourage the Australian government to also start to think about their government policies in terms of the SDGs. There are more and more countries that start to do that and coordinate between the different departments instead of working in silos to ensure that we hit these targets and not be leaving anybody behind. Now, COVID, coming back to COVID, although you might live a little bit in a bubble there and not feeling fully the effects of the global world, there is no question that COVID is accelerating things. People have discovered that you cannot have healthy people on an unhealthy planet. Increasingly, this complex relationship between biodiversity, human health, climate change, the economy, inequality, now a racial dimension. With the tragic death of George Floyd, these correlations are increasingly being seen and being understood. And actually the correlation, the relationships between them is easier made transparent. It's also encouraging to see that during COVID, ESG or environmental, social, or governance, or companies that were operating under a multi-stakeholder, a longer-term business model, putting purpose at the core, actually have performed better, significantly better, about 30% better in terms of total returns than the companies that didn't. It is therefore no surprise that we have seen a maximum inflow of ESG funds, that we're seeing the financial market getting more interested, and indeed also governments. The biggest change-up has come on climate, obviously, where we now have many governments in the world making commitments to be net zero by 2050, China 2060, but increasingly governments are coming in with significant cuts between now and 2030 or 2035. In the case of the UK, a 78% cut. In the case of the EU, a 55% cut by 2030. And the US has just come in, obviously, with Biden and John Kerry being incredibly active, not only joining the Paris Agreement again, but also coming in with a 50% cut. We now have 60 to 70% of the world making the net zero commitments. The risk for not following is being uncompetitive, having stranded assets, dealing with the unintended consequences. And for Australia, they will not be small. Australia might think I'm a small contributor to climate change, or it doesn't matter. Many in your government seem to belittle it, unfortunately, and in my Dutch style, I want to be direct. But although greenhouse gases have declined marginally since 2000 in your country, little progress has been made.
Apologies for interrupting, Paul. We need to wrap the session up in about 5 to 10 minutes, and I'm keen to give people an opportunity to ask the questions about either incrementalism or collaboration. So I don't mean to talk across you.
I'll wrap it up in 5 minutes.
Lovely.
So what I want to say is there's clear momentum with the governments moving, the financial sector moving, citizens asking for it, employees in your companies, and in fact, the business world itself. We have seen more businesses join the science-based target initiatives or any of the other collective efforts out there. What we now need is not anymore debate on the what needs to be done, but how to do it. What we're missing is the speed and scale of moving. And that is obviously at the heart of your question that you're posing already, and the heart of your systems change that is needed. Right now, too many companies still stay only in commitments on scope 1 and 2, what is under their control, whilst the biggest impact is, in fact, is in your value chain. Too many make commitments that are basically on not to lose versus commitments that are needed to win. So they feel uncomfortable being bolder. Many of the things that need to happen require partnerships with governments and many others. So what we're talking here about is the broader systems changes that are needed. Decarbonizing a global economy, making it regenerative instead of linear, circular or regenerative, making it more inclusive, moving financial markets to the longer term. And these broader systems changes that are needed to make ultimately capitalism work, to make the world function for us and for generations to come, require our collective effort. Currently, we're walking around, frankly, as if our shoelaces are tied to each other and we're shuffling along. Why not create the bolder collectives that are needed? One of the reasons I created Imagine is to put a coalition together of businesses around the value chain at CEO level that has a critical mass. Once you have about 20 to 30% of companies together around the value chain, you can drive tipping points. All of a sudden, you can attack the issues of regenerative agriculture or moving to sustainable cotton or getting plastics out of the oceans, things that individual companies cannot do. So one of the main things to drive these systems changes is this collective action that we would be arguing for. I want to end on one sentence, very simple for the interest of time, is that the companies that will survive in the future are companies that think net positive, not how can I be less bad or manage my risk or be in the CSR space. No, you actively need to show that you make this world a better place. Otherwise, why should we keep you around? The second thing is you need to have these longer term multi-stakeholder models with purpose at its core to be successful. And the third thing is you need to participate in these broader transformative changes beyond your own interest. 60-70% of the solutions around climate change, more on some of the other sustainable development goals, can be done today already with the technology available. And yet we're paralyzed like deer in the headlights in many cases. So the most important thing that we need to unlock is our own leadership skill, our own willpower. We've never been so forewarned about what is going to happen. We've never been so forearmed with tools to do something about it. But we need to unlock this leadership inside of us, putting the interest of others ahead of our own, knowing that by doing so, we're better off ourselves as well. More purpose-driven, more partnership, thinking multi-generational. These are the leaders that we need. These are the leaders that you are, otherwise you don't belong to the global compact. Now we need to put our collective forces together to drive the changes at speed and scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That was an amazing start to the day. I'm going to take a couple of questions here in the room and a couple of questions online. I'll start with one online and then go to one here. There's one which has had a lot of support, which was about really investors demanding short-term returns. And the example given is that of the Danone chair and CEO who was essentially forced out recently. So how does one deal with investors that are demanding short-term performance, short-term returns above anything else?
It's a little bit of a loaded question, and actually I don't agree with the premise that it was the short-term investors that put out the CEO. Emmanuel Faber is a great friend of mine and is a great CEO. He made him the first entreprise à mission in French, which means basically a B Corp, legal protection. He's very much into just transition, regenerative agriculture. He's a great CEO. But in this case, it was the board who failed him. And he just gave an interview in the Financial Times. That's why I now feel comfortable to share this with you, that he didn't have the backing of the board, who was running a different agenda, some different fractions there, which tells you that if you go into this change process, you don't only need to keep your financial community happy, but also your boards and other things. I just want to point out that the other alternative of Milton Friedman's short-termism or shareholder primacy. We've seen the average age of a publicly traded company in the US go down during my lifetime from 67 years to 17 years. We've seen the average tenure of a CEO go down from about 10, 12 years to less than 4.5 years. We have enough evidence now that companies that are run just for the short term to satisfy a certain group of small shareholders, if I may say, is not the right way to run these global economies. Increasingly, we see these broader coalitions also for shareholders to see if we can move these financial markets to the longer term. Fiona Reynolds, another Australian I should have mentioned, is running the Principles of Responsible Investment, PRI, for the UN Global Compact. And there are enormous coalitions coming out, also now for the COP26, behind moving the investments and the financial markets to the longer term. So I think we will move in the right direction, but we do need some legislation and some government intervention to speed up that process.
Totally agree. Thank you, Paul. There's a question here in the room. If you can, keep it as brief as you can.
Sure, I can do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Ross White from Think Impact. Yeah, thank you very much, Paul, for an outline of the problems and some of the solutions. The question is, where do you see the key sticking points? Everyone in this room, I'm sure, is furiously agreeing with a lot of what you say. Where are the sticking points that we should be focusing on to actually get to some of those solutions that you outline?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll go very quickly for the interest of time so we can get more questions. But the first one is, I think personally it's leadership. We need moral leadership. So this is a leadership transformation as much as a systems transformation. And we frankly lack courageous leaders. If the average tenure of a CEO is 4.5 years, if their compensation system, which is the case for 80%, is still less than 1.5 years in terms of compensation, if the boards are still the key drivers of that short-termism, we get dysfunctional behavior. First one is leadership, create the right leaders. The second one is we need to have the right environment so that we behave. And this requires a measuring system. People say we measure what we treasure. So we need a broadening measuring system. If we only measure the financial return on financial capital, then some people are very good at that, and that's what you see. But if we can also get the return on social or environmental capital, then I think capitalism is able to balance and run this multi-stakeholder model. The IFRS is now starting a major effort with the Sustainable Standard Board. Europe has its green economy, Green Deal and taxonomy. The US SEC is starting to talk about it. So I think we have the right momentum now to start working on the measurement systems as well. And then thirdly, the governments. The governments have enormous amounts of money that they need to spend to right-size these economies again. We need to be sure that we get the right policies in place that work for us, not against us. We still have 600 billion per fossil subsidies, 700 to 800 billion per subsidies in our dysfunctional food chain. So the third element would be government policies, for the interest of time.
Thank you, Paul. A very good question has come in online. If CEOs are not doing what needs to be done, I guess, across the sustainability field, have you seen examples or good examples of how employees can mobilize within an organization to create that change that's needed?
Oh, excellent example. And I've mentioned that many times before, that you mentioned Greta Thunberg and your introduction, the Swedish girl who's moved us all up at a higher level of moral consciousness, perhaps. I've said many times to CEOs, in every company, there is a Greta Thunberg now. Employees don't want to work for you anymore if you don't behave responsibly. There's a totally new generation coming in. I was just talking this morning with a company here in Europe that had as biggest problem being an attractive brand. But if you then looked at how the company was running its business, it was self-explanatory. So we've seen, for example, and I'll mention the companies, not to be shy about that, but that Amazon, before Jeff Bezos got interested in climate change, and he's come a long way, by the way, 8,000 employees threatened to walk out unless he signed up on the commitments. And he made it 2039 commitments to be net zero. Even in Microsoft, Satya Nadella is one of the best CEOs in the world. He was threatened by his employees when he was trying to give face recognition equipment to the US government. A manufacturer of mattresses who was trying to deliver to the border control, where children were separated from their parents. The employees walked out, and the list goes on. In every company, there's now an activist, and people simply don't want to work for you anymore. Or if they do, they certainly don't want to give them full selves to have this high engagement that you want if you don't align the strategies with, as a minimum, the planetary boundaries, but ideally, this net positive, regenerative thinking that I'm trying to introduce.